for your very nice introduction. And I must say, I'm very honored to be invited. I have a thought for Enrica, who is not here today, but I think of her. And I am, oh, how come that I see you? Okay. So I'm happy to be here today and to talk about my research. And I have entitled this presentation, The Need for Evidence-Based Strategies to Navigate the Changed Linguistic Landscapes in Education. And because most of my research focuses on the topic of mobility. And why is it on mobility? It gradually emerged in my research because the more I discovered the topic and the more I realized that mobility today is beyond what we are used to. Um, it has erased the linguistic and cultural boundaries that previously existed, at least in our imagination, and particularly in the context of education. So the topic of mobility in education is central for all of us today. And in this lecture, I will place it within the field of intercultural communication. So it's also very sensitive, both linguistically as culturally, as it touches upon social exclusion, segregation, and discrimination. Very bad words. I'm sorry for those. And I will argue for the need to re-problematize the notions of inclusion, exclusion, integration, or segregation in education. And this is really what I would like to talk about today as we see the gaps between the so-called advantaged and disadvantaged populations widening. So I will do so in the light of mainly three research projects that I have carried out or that I am carrying out today and that follow one another over time. And I will use an interdisciplinary approach combining sociolinguistic and educational perspective. Okay. So it's important to realize that there has been lots of research on migration, especially in the 80s in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, and that they really, this bunch of research really set the scene on the topic of integration of migrant students. But what I would argue today is that the current migration flow is different, both because of the larger number of migrants and because of the increased heterogeneity of their countries of origin. So in many Western countries, schools have experienced a dramatic increase in the number of newcomer students, and especially in 2015, where different events in the world have created an influx of refugees around the world. And contrary to previous migration patterns, the current migrant population is extremely diverse. And in fact, the group is not well defined, as was stated in a European Commission document already in 2013. So the first question I would like to ask here is whether all these students can be considered as one group, and if not, what does this imply for education and for research? I read not a long time ago this book that fascinated me. I don't know if you can see. And in this book, there is a chapter written by Browder. And Browder, he did a quantitative study on recently resettled refugee students learning English in American high schools. And in this study, Browder compares the impact of limited or interrupted education on the development of literacies in the school language. So limited would be a child that would be, so like we met, for instance, 2 years ago in our research with Professor Jim Cummins, a child who said, yes, I went to school, but I was for 3 years in grade 1. So this is typically what limited education would be. So for instance, in refugee camp where there is the resources are so limited that the students just stay at the same grade, same level for a couple of years. Or interrupted education is when students would have missed significant school for significant periods of time, for instance, weeks, months, or years. But what is interesting in his research is that his results show that school history does not explain the observed variability in literacies. And these results, for me, really highlight the extreme heterogeneity of the group, even challenging preconceived notions about interrupted learning, not always being synonym of low literacy level like we often assume. So this inherent heterogeneity forces us to reconsider our perspectives on education in light of this new situation. In the same book, there is a very, very nice example of a nice. It's not nice, it's terrible, but that I would like to take as a metaphor for this presentation. It is the story of a Cambodian student whose blessed bracelet was cut off by the police during his arrest in the US. And separated from this religious subject, this student felt threatened by evil spirits and dispossessed of his cultural identity. And for me, this example serves as a metaphor to illustrate the loss that refugee students have endured not only before coming to our countries, to their host countries, but continue to endure after their arrival in their host country. And that's where they say that the excitement of arrival in the host country can turn into deep disappointment, even disengagement and oppositional behavior. So it's really it tells is the failure of very well intentioned programs and pedagogical approaches that emphasize academic ownership rather than the institutional and social aspects of integration, and too often ignore the linguistic and cultural assets that students bring with them. So I will not just try to identify the problem, I will also try to provide you with avenues and pedagogical responses to support the resilience and autonomy of these students. And this is the perspective I will take in this presentation. So as you will, if you go on the internet, and in fact, in one of the courses I'm giving at the moment, I ask my students to do so. There is a growing number of resources and training courses on diversity, on intercultural communication, to support the immediate needs of schools. And my projects are part of them. And these initiatives all claim to address the needs of schools and education staff regarding refugee students, often by offering a range of material on intercultural issues. And these efforts are necessary, that's for sure, and laudable. But all too often, it seems that resources are added here and there to meet needs, immediate needs, and in a way to avoid questioning the functioning of the educational system in which we navigate so comfortably for so many years. And this is also clear in light of, for instance, recent articles. I'm sure you may have read some of them on the internet about our failure to address the needs of our students during the pandemic. It seems to me that a questioning of this system in the longer term is absolutely necessary. So there is another question, and the other question is whether these internet resources are sufficiently informed about what is needed to achieve optimal integration and social inclusion of refugee students in the local schools and social environment on the long term. So I won't criticize or evaluate these resources, quite the contrary, but I just want to take a step back to understand what is really at stake. So I will try to give a kind of ethnographic study of the group of students with a refugee background, and I will try to show how intercultural communication can help us to better understand the situation and to develop an education based on what Professor Jim Cummins calls a transformative pedagogy in education. So it is obvious, but I think it is important to remember that all children, including children from refugee background and including those seeking asylum and those with a refugee status, have a universal right to schooling. Uh, but strangely enough, it is easily said than done. It is less easily realized. And in fact, schools are faced with many challenges related to the schooling of this population. The first one is obvious. The first one is related to differences between the languages of the students and those of the host country. So the most widely adopted strategy in different countries in this regard has been to support the learning of the language of the school, while often, too often, discouraging or even prohibiting the student's language in the school setting. And unfortunately, it still happens. The second challenge is about the life experiences of the students with a refugee background before they enter the new school. So for these students, experiences may include, as you may guess, traumatic events of circumstances such as exile, poverty, war, abandonment. And these experiences, I remember vividly a project we have done with Antoinette Gagné, who you know, in which students were explaining to us, young students, these experiences, and we were really like almost shocked by what they were telling us. So these experiences have to be taken into account in education. And it's also important to realize that these circumstances also deeply affect the languages, as they may have crossed many borders and settled in particular countries or regions for weeks, months, or even years before having to flee again. And the third challenge from the perspective of educational trajectory is that refugee students have a high probability of periodic interruptions in their previous schooling, as well as participation in several different school, language, environments, also meaning different curricula, for instance. So these experiences may lead to delays in learning acquisition, and that's what we think of uh, in basic literacy skills, including reading, writing, and numeracy, for instance, but not per se. Huh? So school systems from North America to Europe are struggling to address these problems and the tendency to segregation that often results. So I will examine the issue of social segregation from a legal, ethno-linguistic, and intercultural perspective. So legal, ethno-linguistic, and intercultural perspectives. And then I will try to give a brief overview of current research on intercultural communication in education, adopting a multidisciplinary perspective and describing the different methodological approach. And finally, again, I'll try to open perspective on what Cummins calls transformative pedagogies. So what is a students with a refugee backgrounds? So it's important to realize that even if it's obvious, so I'm sorry if I'm stating the obvious, but leaving one's own country and seeking asylum is not a light decision. And the reality is that many people are forced to flee their country because they are victims of discrimination, persecution, death, or poverty. So asylum seekers often leave everything behind. They risk their lives during the journey and are likely to be in a very poor health and material poverty on arrival in the host country. So this is they come in a situation of great vulnerability. And this vulnerability has pushed national and international legislation to put laws in place to protect them. So consequently, once people have applied for refugee status and until such decision is taken, they are considered asylum seekers, which gives them a number of rights, including the rights not to be returned to their country of origin. In 2015 and 16, 1.2 million people sought asylum in Europe, and 700,000 in 2017 compared to 214 per year before 2014. So you see, it's a deep increase. And 30% of this population was minors. And of this subset, about 20% were under 14, which obviously has very important consequences for education. So again, some of you may be very familiar with that, but some may not. Regardless of national laws and regulations, education is a right, and most countries have ratified the Convention of the Right of the Child. And this convention stipulates that minors must receive appropriate protection regardless of their legal status. But not only, it also stipulates that education must respect the child's parents, cultural identity, language, and values. Those words are not light. It's Article 28 and 29 if you want to look it up. It means that we have to support the language, the cultural identity, and the values of each student. It is not optional. It is something we have to do. So in spite of this regulation, unfortunately, countries vary considerably in their application, resulting in great variability in the extent to which students are respected and even supported in their cultural identity, languages, and values. And the use of the concept of culture here is very interested. It is not neutral. And it's, in fact, it is Dervin who says that if it is not used in a clear intercultural framework, it may even add to the exclusion of these populations. So intercultural communication is really at the heart of the concept of mobility. So mobility implies reciprocal communication between people across borders and cultures. So the concept of culture, which originally refers to the common norms held in a particular group, becomes much more fluid in the case of refugee families. And I could tell you, for instance, I'm not a refugee, but I'm a migrant. And just from how we have been influenced by the countries in which we have lived, and our food pattern, for instance, has been influenced by the country we have lived in, is for me a great example of that. But let's return to the case of the refugees. I think it can be illustrated by this example, which is imaginary, of course. So imagine a family threatened by war in Yemen, for instance. The family may have fled to one of the border countries. Some of the family may have stayed there. Some may have continued their journey. They may have tried to escape by boat, on foot, to flee to a safer country, and perhaps crossing different countries on their way. And often a family like the one in this example stays in the same place long enough for the children to have learned a language or even attended a school, for example, in a refugee camp. Some children were even born in this refugee camp, so never have seen the country where they are supposed to come from, which is also important. So upon arrival in what will be one of what they believe to be their host country, the children will enter a new school. Why did I say they believe? Because, for instance, I was once in Sweden, and like I show on this map, and I met a father from Yemen, and he started to talk to me in a perfect Dutch. And I was like, what? How come? And he told me, he said, I just spent 10 years in the Netherlands until our case was rejected. So we had to go to Sweden. So imagine the children of this particular father were educated in the Netherlands, and then they have to go to Sweden to start all over again. So, from the perspective of the host country and in the light of a normative vision of school development, it is all too easy to view the academic profiles of these students as deficient. But another more positive view of the mobility of these students is that they often bring a dynamic plurilingualism enriched by intercultural experiences to schools. I just talked about it, but while the often complex and sometimes prolonged journey prior to the arrival of refugees are often not ignored but considered relatively irrelevant in the context of schooling, continued mobility after arrival in the host country is an even more frequently neglected aspect of migration. And we teacher, when we get a student, we tend to expect that student to stay with us. So, but once they arrive in countries where they intend to settle, refugee families often continue to be forced to relocate after arrival, like these students were telling us in the Edina project, for instance, or 2 years ago in the Binogi project. So, this mobility, these journeys continually force students to cross multiple borders between continents, countries, regions, villages, schools, classrooms, and etc. And these multiple transitional experiences are an integral part of their multicultural identity. So the scope of mobility goes far beyond the simple displacement from one country of origin to a new country of settlement, exposing these children to many situations of interculturality. So let's go back to the practical educational point of view. So from this point of view, there are issues related to the integration of refugee students that are in fact complex to resolve and that I've tried to put into questions here. How can schooling be supported despite language and curriculum differences, for instance? In which languages should they be educated and according to which curriculum? I will always remember a principal in I think it was from Iceland, who came to me and who said he had their village had received a large population of Bulgarian students, and he said, "In which language should I school these students? Because we can be sure." That their case will be rejected. So they will have to go back. They won't be able to stay. But this can take up to 2 years. So should I school them in the local language, which it will probably take them 2 years to learn that language, or in their own language, risking to segregate them? So these questions are highly intercultural, and not addressing them increases the risk of social exclusion. So, of course, the implementation of answers to these questions depends ultimately on local context and the answers, but the answers itself touches upon fundamental human rights. For example, the right to access education under the same conditions as nationals and to be supported in one's own language and cultural values. End of the quote. So the logical conclusion are simple. These students, like any other student, have the legal right to be educated in all countries, with the notable exception of the United States and Somalia, by the way, which have not ratified this convention. But even where these values are universally accepted, there are significant social and practical challenges. So I did my dissertation on international schools. And what I discovered is that in most countries of the world, expatriate students are guaranteed continuing education in their own language or in a language of economic and political power chosen by their parents. And with a continued curriculum, by the way. So this contrasts somewhat with the conditions of integration of students with a refugee background into mainstream education. So although integration policies and practices vary considerably from country to country and within countries, there are also common features. Um, the first one would be that they all mainly focus exclusively on the target language, the school language, whose estimated proficiency will greatly influence the school and the level at which the student will be integrated. And this is based on the assumption that the local school culture is monolingual and monocultural. And this means that educational potential that can only be revealed, for instance, by using a language that the student masters is ignored. And it is obviously what we call an assimilative approach to education that serves a conservative model of cultural diversity. And it has a number of consequences. One of them being, for instance, the integration into mainstream education that is often delayed because students must first learn the target school language. The second being the risk that language skills are confused with academic skills. So you see, focusing too much on target language acquisition as a condition for entry into mainstream education is a strategy that is based on the deficiency perspective of refugee students, and it can have consequences such as segregation. Luckily enough, countries are increasingly aware of these biases created by this deficit approach to learning, and most have recently, more or less recently, introduced more integrative strategies. So I give you here some of the examples, and I think that I won't spend too much time on it. But these examples illustrate relatively recent policies that show a gradual shift from a primary focus on target language acquisition, which is to solve a deficit, to stimulating more optimal integration, for instance, by taking advantage of the academic potential that already is there. So the current structure of education is often based on ethnocentric ideologies regarding language and culture, in that they benefit from rapid assimilation of language, norms, and curriculum knowledge. And in several countries, this paradigm is being transformed into more inclusive policies regarding the language of schooling. And these policies, it's interesting because they are manifested through the inclusion of languages other than the language of the host country in the curriculum of refugee students. However, in the context of refugee education, it's really interesting to see that the extent to which students are expected to remain in the host country significantly influences inclusive language policies. So, for instance, so-called first host or immigration countries, um, where migrant students are expected to stay only temporarily, are more likely to offer instruction in a language other than the school language, for instance, English, while in host countries, also called immigration countries like France, the Netherlands, Sweden, or even Canada, where students are expected to seek asylum, rapid language assimilation is still considered a primary target. So the option of multilingual education is rarely seriously considered. And yet here again, the situation seems to be slowly changing. So it's interesting because countries and sites really differ in the extent to which they support students' languages. And um, countries are also not stable. So apologies if I say something about the country and it's not true anymore. It changes very fast. So there are various initiatives that have been taken in Europe to support refugee students in their own languages after school, for instance. And the Netherlands was one of them. And it was already introduced in the 90s following the bunch of researchers I was talking about at the beginning. And it was even sponsored by the government until 2004, where the government cut funding. And the reason was that the practice was claimed to be ineffective. So students were considered segregated in extracurricular programs, and they couldn't prove any increase in performance in academic subjects for these students. So people who had worked very hard for the implementation of these um, 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 after school strategies, after school courses were furious. I remember very vividly. But it is very interesting to see that in recent years, translanguaging or language friendly strategies or the flexible use of several languages to legitimize all language resources have found their way into the classroom. So remember, the program that was cancelled by the government in the Netherlands was an extracurricular program. But I tend to believe that the fact that it was cancelled has, in fact, pushed teachers and policymakers to imagine new, more inclusive strategies like the introduction of language resources, all language resources into the classroom. And I believe that this was also thanks to various in-service training projects that were conducted at the time. So this time the focus is really not on one language exclusively, but on all the languages present in the classroom. So this is a change in pedagogy, which is particularly interesting with regard to the concept of inclusion in relation to the concept of integration we talked about before. So plurilingual translanguaging or language-friendly strategy pedagogies, like I call them, can promote inclusion both in the educational environment and in the wider social environment, provided that they promote the inclusion of all individuals and not just one or two students with a refugee background. So the underlying principle is that inclusion strategies should address different groups as an enrichment of the whole school community and thus benefit every member of the community. So what we would hear from teachers or from principals, especially in 2015, when they were really overwhelmed by the amount of newcomer students, was that how can we do that? How can we include every student's linguistic and cultural repertoire, given the rich multicultural and multilingual school context created by the arrival of refugees? Um, and it was funny because it was used as an excuse. It was really like you are, it's very nice what you are telling us, you researchers, but how do you want us to do that? But very difficult does not mean impossible, and it all starts with an awareness which is the basis of intercultural competence. So I do believe that it is our enormous challenge for us, teachers and researchers, to identify and address the principles underlying the concepts used in education, namely integration, inclusion, plurilingualism, and to present this knowledge through practitioner channels, such as, for instance, in-service teacher training. Um, in 2010, so it's already some time ago, a report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development showed that up to 95% of teachers did not feel competent to support their students in education. And honestly, it seems to me that if today we would do the same, we would give the same survey to teachers, the results would be even worse. So every day we see new articles like the one I was showing you at the beginning, showing that education that is in place is not working as we would like it to. So it is interesting to see to realize that before the so-called refugee crisis, many countries did not offer specific training for teachers to teach these students. And if they existed, they were often modest in content and optional. And in these trainings, one aspect which has been recognized from the outset is the need for expertise in second language teaching and learning. But knowledge in second language teaching and learning is necessary, but not sufficient. So differences in literacy levels, languages, mastery of the school language, so the paradigm of language as a problem, socioeconomic situation, and possibly health problems add to the complexity of student schooling. So, in a number of countries, intercultural skills or competence have been added to teacher training, and intercultural competence is here defined. I'm using definition, which is the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in intercultural situation on the basis of one's intercultural knowledge, skills, and attitude. So numerous tools have been created around the acquisition of linguistic and cultural knowledge for intercultural contact. And one example is a culturally focused approach, an essentialist approach that delineates them and the other from us. So, and it is an approach, like you may guess, that contributes unintentionally to stereotypes about culture. These stereotypes are also referred to as stereotypes. And the problem with them is that they can lock students into predefined identities that prevent them from developing memberships in different groups. So for instance, I remember when I was working in the Netherlands, a student who had American background because his parents were from Morocco. He was in fact born in Spain and had spent the first years of his life in Spain, had gone to school there, and there was no mention of Spain in his files, or all the school was referring to him as American child. So it really consists of putting an emphasis on cultural differences. And in a number of countries, um, um, these approaches have been recognized as not contributing to optimal inclusion in the context of cultural diversity. But these approaches can be contrasted with multicultural models of cultural diversity. These are closer to liberal approaches to education. So, in a number of countries, the guidance of teachers in directing their students to different types of secondary school is crucial. And if teachers base their assessment on their students' lack of academic knowledge, the first being the academic mastery of the school language, refugee students are more likely to be oriented to the more technical streams of education with lower intellectual demands. And in some places, policymakers have become aware of these biases and they have developed a more liberal approach to education. And the aim is really to provide teachers with intercultural competence mainly by stimulating their awareness of value system as opposed to that of their students. So for instance, we would talk about a third culture. And in this model, each culture has its own value and must be respected. Um, so reflection on one's own cultures, beliefs and attitudes is of course an essential aspect of intercultural competence. But more recently, scholars like Dervin and Hall have stressed the importance of a critical ability to question the implicit and explicit assumptions behind cultural claims and the power dynamics that they may be concealing. End of the quote. And this is linked to a broader concept of social justice, which applied in this context implies a careful assessment of existing potential inequalities. So when we listen to school stakeholders, very often we hear that they are concerned with questions like, how do we react to behavior that we do not understand? How can we have a more complete vision of students' needs and ambitions when we do not share a common language and culture, etc., etc.? So it is precisely when faced with these challenges that the mentioned paradigm of language as a problem becomes an obstacle to possible solution. So I believe that this problem can be overcome when teachers are asked to consider students and their families not only as persons different from themselves, which would be essentialist or liberal approaches, but also as students with unequal opportunities, which would be a more critical interculturalism. So the next step in this process is the adaptation of a progressive vision of plurilingualism that views the students' linguistic and cultural experiences as an asset and a learning opportunity. So this new wave of methods is spreading, and we are so happy about that. And what these methods have in common is that they are based on a conscious reflection on the history, religious, and social experiences and biography of each student. And this approach is reflected in a number of pedagogical initiatives, such as let's compare our languages from Auger, it's already from 2008, or Cuman's work on identity text, and especially his work with Margaret Early in 2011, Gail Prazad's work on language biographies, or even uh, the introduction of students' languaging into the classroom to support learning and social inclusion, also known as translanguaging practices. And it is in this context that our language-friendly school initiative was born. Because we believed that to be truly inclusive, education must go beyond the classroom walls. So I talked to you about out of school initiatives to include the languages and cultures. Then we saw that there was a new initiative of including these languages and culture into the classroom. And now I'm talking to you about education that should go beyond the classroom walls. And the question is why? And in our language-friendly school, Ellen Rose Campbell and I, we see the school as a meeting place where students, parents and staff, often from diverse backgrounds, are united to share and build up knowledge. And in fact, I borrowed this school as a meeting place from her name. I forgot her name, so I promise I will come back to it. So if we conceive of the school as a meeting place, then we go far beyond the classroom walls, and we include, for instance, the janitor, the principal, the families, the communities around the school, etc. So in fact, many studies in different fields have shown the benefits of stronger involvement, for example, of parents and an older sibling in the children education. So one of the first questions we would get when we would go to a school in 2015 was, how should we work with family who have gone through major traumatic events? And so it's interesting because as awareness of the possible trauma caused by experiences of war and violence was growing, we became aware, more and more aware of the need to work closely with parents, communities, mental health services, and non-governmental organizations. And I will maybe go a bit fast about that, but I think that it's extremely interesting. So these all act as intercultural, linguistic, and cultural mediators who are invited to negotiate the meaning of exchanges to help people understand each other, understand the new target society, and prevent misunderstanding. So there are all types of intercultural mediators: the parents and families, the students, settlement workers, and volunteers. But also, I would like to introduce today online digital technologies. I'm mindful of the time, so I will go a bit faster. So there are many benefits to parental involvement, but the problem is that parental involvement in schools is often limited due to a lack of opportunities for involvement, difficulty understanding educational language, or a lack of common language that hinders communication. So, in light of this knowledge, many educational projects have attempted to encourage stronger partnership between parents and school. And in fact, it was here in one of our projects where we invited parents to come to school and to work with their children. But increased parental involvement requires time and trust, both ways, to overcome existing stereotypes about groups, cultural, and national identities. And to overcome these difficulties, students themselves are often used as linguistic and intercultural mediators. But the problem is that they are often not recognized as such. So, Propoq, Klein, and Crafter studied the advantages and disadvantages of this strategy by asking parents and children to evaluate it. And what they concluded was that it was not entirely positive or negative, but that children's involvement as language and cultural brokers must be carefully prepared, and that for that, teachers must be sufficiently interculturally competent to prepare students for this role. I'm not sure you're here, so I will pass. But what I wanted to present is one of our language friendly school here in Toronto, which is the Silver Creek. This is exactly what they did. They framed these students as language and cultural mediator in a much broader and long-term pedagogical approach. So what we do in the language friendly school is that we train team to set up mediation initiatives framed by the community represented by the schools and the professionals enrolled in the group. So in this example, the schools has developed a function that is called school ambassadors. And the school ambassadors, here they were when we were visiting the schools. I can tell you they were very proud of their function. They were carefully chosen and they knew exactly what their role was in the school. What you see, and especially in Ontario, are settlement workers, but also in other parts of the world. So the participation of competent members of a language community, which is an important and often overlooked opportunities. So there are many initiatives, but what is interesting to note is that by introducing intercultural mediators from these communities, also called here in Ontario settlement workers, host societies recognize the potentially rich resources that these individuals and their life experiences represent for the integration of refugee students in education. So from an intercultural point of view, this approach contributes to a gradual change of perspective from the paradigm of language and culture as a problem to the recognition of the richness of cultural and linguistic diversity. And finally, we have the digital technologies, which I think are an answer, or at least a part of the answer to the question I was asking before. If we assume that by reaching a higher level in their language, learners will be able to transfer this knowledge to the other language, then we must work to strengthen these languages through the content of teaching. And this means that teachers need to provide opportunities for students to reformulate similar concepts in their own languages, to encourage language manipulation, to help understanding, to foster, for instance, linguistic redundancy, repetition, and above all, reinforcement to enrich each of the languages in the children's repertoire in the same way. So it is something that you find, for instance, in bilingual families when both parents are bilinguals, but which is often difficult to set up in a school context because it would require the teachers to speak the languages of the students. But now we have these incredible online resources for translating content into the languages in question. So within the SK project that involve 3 different projects and many co-researchers, some of which are present today. I'm happy, honored to be able to work with Jim Cummins, but also with Leanne and with Rosalia, I think, who is here too. And we are working with a platform that is called Binogi. And Binogi is an online program that consists of a series of lessons based on the local curricula. And that I wouldn't call it a translanguaging strategy, but much more a co-teaching, I would say, method that teacher can use. It is based on small videos using everyday language to which the concept to be acquired are added, but with a high degree of contextual support. There are videos, so contextual cues are very important. And it is an asset for all students, not only for multilingual students. But the second crucial aspect is that the videos are offered in the languages of the school, but also in a number of other languages. And these languages are available orally and in written form as subtitles and quiz question. And each time the student has the choice of the combination of languages and media. So in addition to visual cues, there are also comprehension strategies, such as, for instance, slowing down the speaking or accelerating the narrative flow. And this material, of course, implies a certain familiarity of the teacher and the students and ideally the families with these computer programs. But what is interesting is that the cognitive demand is high, but adjustable according to the language background of the students. And what is also very interesting is that you will see that the comprehension aid materials are not discriminating. You don't need to exclude the student or to pull out the student to include them. They are integrated into the platform, into the context. So in fact, yeah, to come back to it, it's interesting because it does exactly what it does challenge patterns of power relations of our very own educational system that becomes also theirs by displaying their languages. So it really challenges what Jim Cummins often says, coercive relations of power. So I guess I must conclude, so I will. So the widespread mobility and often complex pre- and post-arrival trajectories that characterize the refugee population requires highly flexible and adaptable educational strategies. And in the years following the so-called refugee crisis in Europe, great efforts have been made to address the needs of refugee students, to support their language and academic education, and to train teachers in intercultural communication. But there is still room for improvement. Um, because the organization of the education of these students also depends on our the value that we attribute to the repertoire of these students, of the perceived value of languages and of their students' life experiences that is deeply rooted in our own ideological and political belief. This is, in fact, a reflection of this essentialist approach. Since the early 2000s, a gradual shift towards a more liberal model has been introduced, which recognizes the importance of individual experiences and perspectives, and more recently, an awareness that the diversity of the cultural and linguistic repertoire of refugees represents not only a challenge, but also an opportunity and this perspective has emerged in many places. I would say that I believe that the ultimate goal of intercultural training is the promotion of an education that takes into account the individual biographical background and plurilingual repertoires of each of our students, which implies a profound change of pedagogy. So the question is really how to exploit the potentially rich pool of resources on which education and future careers could be scaffolded. The picture you see here is an initiative of our language friendly school again, where parents were invited to write down a wish they had for their child and it was displayed on the school wall. And you see there are many different languages. So I believe that the key is to really in order to address this issue, is to reject the binarity in intercultural communication to the benefits of inclusive approaches, to recast the school as a new community composed of members, all with different skills and needs. So you will find the main reference for this talk is in fact a chapter I've written for the Cambridge Handbook of Intercultural Communication, and I think it's available at the library. Thank you. And of course, there are many, many references.